like Liz says, my name is Megan and I work for Delta Institute. We're a nonprofit here in Chicago that works throughout the Midwest and Great Lakes regions with communities to help solve complex environmental challenges. And I'm very excited to share that the City of Chicago Waste Strategy that we developed in partnership with the Office of the Mayor and Department of Streets and Sanitation was released last month. And here today to talk through some of the strategies in particular related to organics and wasted food. So to give a brief overview of the overall project goals and components, in case anyone has missed a few of the presentations that have been going around earlier in the month, I'll talk a little bit about the work of our partners at UIC to update the city's waste generation and characterization data, and then walk through the strategies related to organics and wasted food, as well as the overall recommendations identified by the city as near-term priorities for the next year. So as a bit of an overview, Delta came on last summer to conduct an assessment of current conditions and develop holistic strategies to overhaul the City of Chicago's materials management system in order to reduce the amount of waste sent to landfills, increase recycling and other diversion, and recover materials for economic benefit. And we're very grateful that we had the opportunity to interview almost 100 stakeholders throughout the process and for the feedback. And we're, again, just thrilled that they were finally available to be reviewed publicly earlier in July. And with this project, the primary goals were to review the current waste and recycling related policies, contracts, data, and infrastructure, engage with stakeholders in the city, both private sector and public sector, as well as Chicago, learn from other cities' successes, failures, and best practices, and develop and prioritize strategies for waste reduction, recycling, and reuse that consider both diverse material types and waste generators. The 5 components of the final waste strategy are the executive summary, which kind of wraps everything up, the existing conditions report, which includes a review of Chicago's current and past waste and recycling programs and infrastructure, additional materials management services available to residents, and a review of existing planning documents and applicable ordinances at city, county, state, and national levels. This report includes information on waste generation and recycling trends in the city and more broadly, as well as the documented impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on materials management. This existing conditions report also includes an analysis of the economic, environmental, public health, and equity impacts of the current waste management system in Chicago. The next report is the Pure City Analysis, which reviews programs and policies that are successful in other municipalities in the Midwest and across the country to identify what has worked well elsewhere and what could serve as a model for the city. Next is the Waste Characterization and Generation Update Report, which I'll talk a bit more in a moment, and all of which, including the interviews with over 90 internal and external stakeholders, helped to develop and prioritize recommendations for Chicago, resulting in finally 63 materials management strategies, 12 of which were identified as immediate priorities for the next year. And all of the reports are now available on the city's website, as well as Delta's, if you haven't had a chance to review in detail and have any questions. So a bit more about the Waste Characterization and Generation Update Report conducted by our partners at UIC. As I'm sure everyone on this call knows, waste data is very difficult to come by and inconsistent at best. And prior to this report, the most recent major waste characterization study for the city was published in 2009. So it's important in developing these strategies to have more up-to-date and relevant data. The team at UIC used sampling data from 2009 as a baseline to conduct analysis and modeling to update waste generation and characterization numbers for 2020. These models were supported by previous work from the UIC team, especially in regards to food waste, recent data from the city, peer city comparisons, and consumer and industry trends to develop numbers that we use to establish both the current conditions and prioritize strategies in the report. And one of the areas UIC reviewed was yard waste generation and collection to project the total amount of yard waste being generated and currently disposed from low density residences, which include single family homes up through buildings with 4 units. And the blue bars are the estimated generation in 1,000 tons, totaling between 40,000 and 45,000 tons per year. And the very small gray bars, which are really only visible in August and November, are the volumes collected through the streets and sanitation work orders through the 311 system. And this collected volume still represents hundreds of tons of material sent to composting facilities in Illinois, but clearly doesn't anywhere close match the estimated generation for the city. Overall, UIC estimated that over 522,000 tons of organic waste are generated each year in Chicago. These estimates combine the yard waste projections on the previous slide with food waste estimates from UIC's previous work published in 2019. They also calculated that the diversion of 75% of organic waste from only those low density residences that are serviced by the Department of Streets and Sanitation would result in an almost 19% increase in landfill diversion rate for the city as a whole. So really huge opportunity to improve diversion rates and make a big impact. So shifting now to the materials management strategies. As a high-level overview, the strategies we developed for the city are divided into 7 sections, which are municipal management and data tracking, source reduction, reuse and repair, residential waste reduction, ICI, industrial, commercial, and institutional waste reduction, organics and wasted food, specialty materials, and construction and demolition debris. And as I mentioned, 63 total strategies were developed, 12 of which were identified as high priority items that are achievable within the next 18 months and can build momentum for additional implementation in the next 3 to 5 years as budget requests are put in and more partners are developed and brought on board for implementation. So in order to allow for the city prioritization and budget realities, each category has several potential options for both short-term implementation and long-term planning and budgeting. We labeled each recommendation in the report as optimal, practical, or pilot to help with implementation planning. And optimal strategies are the most ambitious and complex recommendations, which will require significant coordination and resources. Practical strategies are more ready to go and ready to be implemented at full scale, would maybe result in less diversion, less ambitious, but would have significant progress and would have much more feasibility with fewer complexities. And pilot strategies are the most ready to go, typically on a smaller scale, site-specific, and are really ready to be implemented with either city resources or outside funding. And instead of providing a general overview of all 7 of the strategy categories for this group, I wanted to go a bit more in detail on the organics and wasted food category. There are 4 subcategories in this section, and I'll quickly go through the recommendations in each. And as I mentioned before, the strategy report includes a lot more background and context and examples for each of the recommendations, so can provide more detail on each one I'm about to go through, but can also talk through some questions as well. So the first subcategory would be citywide food waste prevention and food rescue. We established practical recommendations to leverage the NRDC Food Matters Great Lakes Regional Cohort participation that the city was accepted into earlier this year to conduct a food rescue assessment of existing infrastructure and gaps, and an optimal strategy of launching a citywide food rescue program for the city of Chicago. The next subcategory would be organics and food scrap collection for Chicago residents. On the practical scale, we had both established permanent drop-off sites for residents at the sanitary district or ward level, as well as improving the existing yard waste collection program and incorporating food scrap right along into that yard waste collection. We also offered a pilot opportunity to introduce drop-off locations through seasonal pumpkin smash events similar to the current Christmas tree seasonal recycling in partnership with the Park District. There's also an optimal strategy to provide opt-in curbside organics collection for all Chicago residents served by DSS, which would be that low density residential. And then another practical strategy to provide information about current organics hauling services to high density residential buildings, some of the private companies that are already in place here in Chicago. Next, we looked at ICI, food waste and prevention and food scrap diversion. On the practical side, looking to identify partnership and support opportunities for industrial, commercial, and institutional entities implementing food waste diversion programs. One of the big points we kept coming to in this strategy is that although the city is the audience for this work, it cannot have the impact it wants to see on its own, and partnerships, especially on these larger institutional generators, are going to be hugely impactful. On the optimal side, we would be requiring the largest food waste generators to divert waste through donation or composting, and a pilot opportunity of incorporating food donation and food scrap composting into city events to reduce organic waste and provide high-profile educational opportunities, typically in partnership with DCASE, the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. We also looked at some opportunities for compost market development, both on the practical side. One would be incorporating additional finished compost into city landscaping maintenance that is already existing, and supporting increased adoption of backyard composting and composting at community garden sites, one of which is already moving forward with a partnership with Neighborspace, where they're hoping to pilot at 5 community garden locations, drop off for food scraps for residents in the area. So to wrap up, I wanted to share the 12 recommendations across all categories that were identified by the city as achievable and high priority for 2021 and 2022. And I know with any report like this, the first question is always how it moves from recommendations on paper into action. And I'm happy to report that our partners at the city are very dedicated to this work and have already hit the ground running on several items. First group of short-term priorities are on the policy review and exploration side. This is either looking back at existing materials management ordinances to make adjustments and improvements to increase impact, or conducting the initial research and steps for a new potential legislation. On the new legislation side, this would be around potential waste hauling zones for commercial waste, similar to what the City of New York has recently implemented, and then supporting ambitious statewide extended producer responsibility legislation, which we've seen have a lot of traction recently, most recently passed in Maine. As far as assessing and adjusting existing ordinances, they're both related to the construction demolition debris recycling ordinance, identifying opportunities for increased compliance and contractor education, and potentially targeting specific material types and parameters for reuse as opposed to broad diversion and recycling. The next group of short-term priorities would be increasing opportunities for community interventions. So this would be new programs and educational opportunities for residents to engage with the materials management system and improve that residential waste diversion. One of these is that NRDC Food Matters cohort participation, which is already underway, working to maintain clear and consistent messaging around recycling contamination, introducing the drop-off locations for organics with seasonal pumpkin smash events, which I mentioned earlier, developing a directory of participating retail take-back options for hazardous materials like e-waste and HHW, and establishing a revenue-sharing partnership to expand textile recycling with the City of Chicago. And finally, the last category of short-term implementation for the next 18 months would be strengthening internal operations. This is really focused on the Department of Streets and Sanitation and what they have identified as key priorities for them in advance of any budgetary realignment or new programs. So this is identifying the appropriate blue cart to black cart distribution and potentially different bin size options, expanding the capacity for recycling and reducing that black cart size, improving high density residential recycling ordinance compliance based on the 2020 Office of the Inspector General report findings on that high density residential, and improving Chicago's existing yard waste collection program by researching food scrap ride-along options for that collection.